When I talk to people about near-death experiences, they always start off by saying, I just can't describe it to you. There are no words for it. So then I say, great, tell me about it. So I know I'm making them distort it by putting it into words. And they end up using metaphors to describe what happened to them. So they may talk about being in a meadow or being in outer space or being in some heavenly environment, but they're talking about metaphors. They're not describing literally what they experienced. They almost universally tell me that they are in an environment of unconditional love and well-being and safety, and that seems utterly convincing. So I think the answer, as far as I'm concerned, is that our consciousness does not end when our bodies die.
Hello, passionate listeners and watchers. Welcome to Passion Harvest. Thank you for being here wherever you are in the world. Right now, I am Louisa, your host, International Passion Ambassador. And if you like this episode, please do subscribe. I'm so excited about our guest today, Dr. Bruce Greyson. And if you don't know who he is, Dr. Greyson is one of the primary founders of the scientific study of near-death experiences. Dr. Greyson is the world's leading medical expert on near-death experiences and the continuity of consciousness. Dr. Greyson is Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the UVA School of Medicine. He served on the medical school faculty at the Universities of Michigan, Connecticut, and Virginia. He was a co-founder and president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies and editor of the Journal of Near-Death Studies. His award-winning research led him to become a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and to be invited by the Dalai Lama to participate in a dialogue between Western scientists and Buddhist monks in India. Dr. Greyson is the author of After, a doctor explores what near-death experiences reveal about life and beyond. The book offers answers about the mysteries of life and death and includes several of the most dramatic first-person accounts of near-death experiences. This is his story, and this is his passion. Dr. Greyson, I'm so honored, and welcome to Passion Harvest.
I'm happy to be here with you today.
It's an absolute honor. So let's dive right in. I'd love to, it's a big question. What happens when we die, when we leave, when our physical body dies?
Well, that is the good question, Louisa. Describing literally what they experienced. They almost universally tell me that they are in an environment of unconditional love and well-being and safety, and that seems utterly convincing. So I think the answer, as far as I'm concerned, is that our consciousness does not end when our bodies die, and that whatever comes after our bodies die is something not to be feared. But the actual details of it, I have no confidence that I know what's going on. In fact, I suspect that what happens after death is something so far beyond what I can imagine that I'm going to be very surprised.
That's a wonderful attitude to have. I kind of have the same one as well. I guess in the concept of times, you've done so much research on near-death experiences. Is there a particular case or cases that stand out for you?
I hate to pick one out because each one is so fascinating to me. I'm a psychiatrist, and I love hearing people's stories and what happens to them. And what interests me most about the NDE is not the experience itself, which is mind-blowing by itself, but how it affects people's lives. I make my living trying to help people change their lives, and it's very, very difficult work. And here this experience comes in a few seconds, totally transforms their attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior, and I don't have any tool that's anywhere near that powerful. So I have great respect for the power of this experience, and that's what's most impressive to me about NDEs.
And you're the expert. Generally, people are fundamentally changed after their near-death experience.
Yes.
In what ways are they fundamental? What ways are they changed?
They usually become very much more aware of the spiritual part of their nature. And whether they had a spiritual life before this or not, they come back saying, I'm much more spiritual than I ever was before, by which they mean they feel connected to the universe, to the divine, to other people. They feel much more compassionate and caring about other people. And this plays out in their behavior, which is much more altruistic than it ever was before. And they also become much less concerned with things of this world, material possessions and power, prestige, fame, competition. And this sounds like it will be a fantastic change, but it actually creates a lot of problems for a lot of people. For example, I know a lot of people who were career military or police officers who could not continue their jobs. For example, one fellow I knew was a sergeant in the Marines, and that was always his goal in life. Yeah. And he was serving in Vietnam and was shot in the chest and had shrapnel throughout his lungs. And he was air evac to the Philippines to a hospital. And during an operation there to clear out his lungs, he had a beautiful near-death experience. And when he came back from that, of course, he went through rehab and was sent back into the jungle, and he found he could not shoot. The idea of killing someone was just so abhorrent to him, he just couldn't do his job. So he ended up having to leave the Marines, which had always been his goal in life, and came back to the States and retrained to be a medical technician. And I've heard this again and again and again from policemen who retrained to be healthcare workers or teachers or social workers, from cutthroat businessmen who felt that getting ahead at someone else's expense no longer made sense to them. And they either gave up their businesses or changed how they did business and treated their customers and their employees much more compassionately. I've also known career criminals and addicts who were totally transformed by a near-death experience and gave up their way of life. So that to me is the most impressive part of the whole experience, how it changes people's lives.
And so almost they want to be in service to other people.
Exactly. And that too can create problems, because I know a lot of near-death experiencers who, when a crisis comes up, like a hurricane or some other natural disaster or a bombing, they will just take off at the minute's notice, leave their families behind, and go to where the accident was and try to help. And their families left behind feel, what happened to us? Right. Don't you care about us? This is most poignant in children of near-death experiences who feel that their parent no longer loves them more than anybody else. And that can be very harmful to a child.
Have you done research on the families of near-death experiences and what they think of their potential mother or their father and how they have fundamentally changed?
Yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag. A lot of them have strange reactions at first. They either think that the loved one, whether it's a spouse or a parent or a child, has some kind of a psychotic episode or hallucination, and when they see the changes that persist in the experiencer, they start taking it more seriously, and they may respect the experience and start trying to understand what's going on with this. They may not like the changes. And in fact, if the marriage or the relationship was based on material goods or on something other physical thing, the marriage may break up. But very often, the spouse and the family will adjust to the near-death experiencer and start changing the whole family structure. And the whole family becomes much more spiritual as a result. I should say that they don't become much more religious. Many near-death experiencers say that they feel at home in any house of worship of any denomination, and that no one religion really understands fully what the deity that they experienced was like. It was much greater than anything that the church has ever told them about.
And I mean, obviously, I certainly haven't talked to as many people of near-death experience as you had, but they continue to remember the feeling. Often we forget emotions after a time, whether it might be childbirth or all sorts of experiences, but they don't forget it.
That's right. All memories are subject to change over time, and the memories fade over time. And a lot of the near-death experiences we hear are from people who had the experience years ago, sometimes decades ago. So we had reason to question, are we really getting the right story? Well, I've been doing this research for so long now that I've been able to go back and recontact people I interviewed 40 years ago and ask them to describe their NDE to me again now. And what we found is that there's absolutely no difference. There is no fading of the memory of an NDE over decades. And that's unique among memories we have of any other experience.
That's absolutely remarkable, and what remarkable work you're doing as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Often near-death experiences come back, or they say they come back with certain gifts or spiritual gifts or talents. Do you mind
Yes.
discussing that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, they usually feel they're much more empathic, much more in tune with other people's feelings, emotions. Um, and that may or may not be a paranormal experience or just a heightened sensitivity to other people. But they often feel like they can understand things before they're about to happen, sort of see things unfolding before they're about to happen. They often have a sense of when someone is going to die before that person may know it. And these, again, can cause problems for the near-death experiencer. It's not nice to know when someone's going to die. What do you do with that information? And often the things that they feel like they know in advance are not pleasant things. They're disasters about to happen. I've had lots of near-death experiencers tell me repeatedly that they know when there's going to be a plane crash or an explosion. And I've told them, well, tell me about it in advance so I can document what's going on. And they have. And they've told me specific things. But what do you do with that? You know, you can't call up the FAA and say, there's an Lockheed F-1011 that's going to crash at Dallas Airport tomorrow at 1 o'clock. You'd probably be arrested if you did that. So they're kind of stuck with this foreknowledge that they can't do anything about.
So how do you explain these? Well, I guess there's two elements to this: future premonitions during the near-death experience, and the ones that come as a gift afterwards. How do you explain that?
Well, I'm not sure I can.
Okay, good answer.
I'm a scientist. I'm rooted in the empirical world, and we just don't have explanations for this. This calls for an explanation that's beyond our ability to understand right now. If you want to call it spiritual, it's certainly a non-physical process that's going on. Most near-death experiencers say that in the world of the NDE, there is no sense of time. That time as we know it is a function of the physical world. It doesn't exist in the other realm or the other dimension. So that you can experience everything at the same time during a near-death experience. This is, when I'm listening to people talk about their NDEs, I say, look, you're telling me this happened, then this happened, then this happened, as if it's a sequence. How can you have a sequence without time passing?
Great question.
Yeah, well, they tell me, as I'm sitting here now talking to you, it's a paradox. But when I was actually living it in the NDE, it wasn't a paradox. It made perfect sense. But it doesn't make sense now that we're back here in these brains trying to think through it logically. Our logic and our language can't understand the NDE.
This is obviously, I kind of think I know the answer, but are there commonalities with a near-death experience in general? Is there a white tunnel? Are there lights?
Yeah, there is a commonality, and it goes across cultures, across religions, across centuries. We not only have accounts of NDEs from around the globe now, but we have accounts from ancient Greece and Egypt, from ancient cultures and other places as well. We have accounts from Native American cultures that the French fur trappers took in the 1600s, 1700s. We have accounts from Polynesia, and they're all the same from every culture. Now, how they describe the experience, how they understand it, may be determined by their cultural metaphors they choose to use. But almost everyone feels a sense of overwhelming peace and well-being. They may feel greeted by a warm, loving being of light, which they may or may not put a label on. They often find themselves in some other unearthly realm or dimension. And some of them describe going through a long, dark, enclosed space to get from this realm to the other, which Americans call a tunnel.
Okay.
But I've talked to people from other cultures where there aren't a lot of tunnels. They don't use that. They may say, I went through a cave or I fell into a well, but they will not say tunnel. I talked to one fellow who was a truck driver who said he got sucked into a large tailpipe. So
Okay.
Whatever metaphors you have most available determine how you describe the phenomenon. And likewise, the being of light, most Westerners will call that God, whereas Easterners will not. They will use some other term or just not describe it at all. And in fact, most Westerners will say, I'm going to call it God so that you know what I'm talking about, but it wasn't the God I was taught about in church. It's much bigger than that. but it was something that loved me and that understood me. And you can call it God, Allah, Krishna, all there is, the source, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's beyond words. Um, Beyond that, many near-death experiences report reviewing their lives. And they often report that their entire lives were available to them in minute detail. And they experienced things, not just saw them, but experienced them in much greater detail in the life review than they did in their actual lives. For example, one fellow told me that he relived an event from his childhood in which he could actually count the number of mosquitoes in the air buzzing around him, which he couldn't have done when he was a child.
Mm.
But reviewing it was in such exquisite detail, and in time that could stop, and he could count these things. And these are things that are common across NDEs, across cultures, across ages, genders, religions, that are very common.
And yeah, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Why do you think some people have, I'm not going to use the word negative near-death experience, but experience traumatic death experiences, purgatory or hell or?
Yeah. This points out one of the problems with research. When we first started doing this research back in the 1970s, 1980s, we were relying on people coming forward and telling us about their NDEs. And all we heard were the blissful ones. Nobody came forward and said, let me tell you about going to hell. Because when they started hearing about near-death experiences, they were thinking, well, all those other people are talking about pleasant things. I had a bad one. What's the matter with me? Am I a bad person? And they didn't want to talk about them. And it wasn't until we stopped relying on, quote, volunteers coming forward with their NDEs and started looking in hospitals and interviewing everyone in the hospital who had come close to death that we started hearing about the unpleasant ones. And we did find them. And most researchers who have studied this estimate that between 1% and 5% of near-death experiences are unpleasant. Now, we suspect that's an underestimate because there are still probably a lot of people who don't want to talk about these experiences.
Yeah.
They're just, they're embarrassed by it. They think it says something bad about themselves, or they're just too painful to try to relive, or they may feel it's too personal. They don't want to share it. So I think there are more out there that we just haven't heard. As for why some people have them, I don't know the answer to that. It's certainly not the case that bad people have bad NDEs and good people have good NDEs. I've known people who were on death row who had a heart attack in prison and had beautiful near-death experiences. And I've known people who lead apparently saintly lives and had terrible experiences. And this should not surprise us. I mean, there are accounts from Christian mystics about going through the dark night of the soul, having terrifying experiences, St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila. So we know that saintly people can have terrifying spiritual experiences. Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey, where you have to go through these travails to get to eventual enlightenment. And that may be part of what's going on with these unpleasant near-death experiences. In fact, there are people who start off having an unpleasant NDE and they find them terrifying and they try to fight against it. And eventually they get exhausted and just surrender. And as soon as they surrender, it becomes a blissful experience.
Yes.
So what was the terrifying part was the resistance to it rather than the experience itself.
So it's so fascinating. And in your research, what have you learned about life before birth?
Before birth.
Before birth.
Oh, wow. I'm not sure I can go there.
Okay.
The things that I study, I try to focus on the parts that can be corroborated.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when people claim to leave their bodies in a near-death experience, I look for things that they saw and heard around the body that they couldn't have possibly seen or heard that we can corroborate.
Right.
When people talk about seeing deceased loved ones, I look for information from those loved ones that we can corroborate that no one else knew. When you talk about life before life, that's really hard to corroborate. It's hard, people talk about being in some other dimension before life, and that's not something we can study scientifically. Now, there are occasional people who talk about past lives in their near-death experience, that in their life review, it wasn't limited to this life, but it included facts from a previous life. And those potentially are things that we can corroborate, but there are very few of those, and I'm not sure we have enough to really say much about them.
Very interesting. I have to ask, I mean, I guess this is personal. What fascinates you about near-death experiences? How and why did you get into this research?
I got into it unwillingly. I was raised in a materialistic scientific household, and I grew up believing that the physical world was all there is. When you die, that's the end, and that was fine with me. That's just the way life is. And I went through college and medical school like that, thinking everything was going to be explained by physical science. And then in my first weeks of psychiatric training, I was confronted by a patient who had overdosed, and I was sent down to the emergency room to evaluate her. I was actually sitting in the cafeteria having dinner when the page came in, and the pager went off on my belt and scared the dickens out of me. I was a new intern. And I spilled some spaghetti sauce on my tie, and I tried to wipe it off, and I couldn't. So I just put on a white lab coat to cover it up. So I went down to see this patient, and I couldn't arouse her. She was totally unconscious. But her roommate was waiting to see me in a different room to describe what happened to the patient. So I went down to see the roommate, talked to her for about 15, 20 minutes about what was going on in the patient's life and so forth. It was a very hot Virginia evening, and I was sweating. We didn't have air conditioning back in the 70s. So I unbuttoned my lab coat, exposing the stain on my tie, and then talked to her. And then when I got up to say goodbye to her, I realized I had done that. So I quickly buttoned it up again. And then went back to see the patient, and she was still unconscious. She was admitted to the intensive care unit overnight. And I went to see her the following morning when she had awoken. And I went to see her, and I introduced myself. She was still very, very groggy. And as I started to say who I was, she said, "I know who you are. I remember you from last night." Well, that kind of startled me. So I said, I thought you were asleep when I saw you last night. And she opened her eyes and said, "Not in my room. I saw you talking to my roommate."
Wow.
That just blew me away. I couldn't imagine what she was talking about.
What did you say?
I just sort of stammered for a while. As far as I could tell, the only way that could happen is she had left her body and come down with me. And, as far as I know, I was my body. How can you leave it? It made no sense at all. So she picked up that I was sort of stumbled by this. And she then proceeded to tell me about the conversation I had with the roommate, what I had asked, what the roommate said, where we were sitting. And finally she said, "And you had a red stain on your tie." And that just blew me away. I didn't know what to say. So I said the only thing I could think of. I said, "What?" But I realized that I had a job to do there. I was trying to deal with her problems, not with my problems. So I kind of pushed my thoughts out of the side and just focused on her for a while. And then the days that followed that, I tried to make sense of this, and I just couldn't. And I tried to tell myself this was a trick somehow. The nurses were playing a trick on me, trying to make a fool of the new intern, and somehow they arranged this. I couldn't imagine how, because none of them knew about the stain on my tie. So I just kind of pushed it out of my mind for a while. And it wasn't until about 5 years later that Raymond Moody wrote a book called Life After Life, in which he gave us the term near-death experience and described what they were like. And that was my first inkling that what this patient had told me about was not just one isolated event, but part of a worldwide phenomenon. And it really was something that I couldn't understand, and yet it was there. And it would not have been scientific to pretend it wasn't there, to push it away and say, "I'm not going to deal with this." Science progresses by looking at things we don't understand. So I started thinking, I need to study to understand this. So I started collecting cases, and here I am 50 years later, still trying to understand it.
What a beautiful story. I mean, with that story, there's no doubt that in some way her consciousness was not in her physical body.
Right. I don't know how to explain it any other way. I wish that I knew then what I know now, so I could have asked her more questions about it, but I just didn't know.
Have you ever contacted her again?
No, she was totally lost. She was a first-year student at the university, and she dropped out of school, and I never was able to track her down.
Interesting. And so all this, what all this wonderful work that you're doing, the near-death experience research, what is the significance of it for humanity?
Oh, well, as much as these things tell us about the possibility of life after death, many near-death experiencers say that what's more important is what they tell us about life right here on this and during this life. They come back with this strong sense that we are all part of the same thing. We're all interconnected. And many of us get this from the sense of love they get from the being of light. They feel we're all part of the divine. We're all part of the same thing. They talk about it as being like a wave in the ocean. You're a distinct entity. You're the wave, and yet you're made of the same stuff the rest of the ocean is, and you will eventually go back into it. And yet others say that it came from their life review. Many people have this life review in which they see things not from their own perspective necessarily, but from other people's as well. I'll give you a specific example of this. One fellow he was in his 30s when he was working under a truck, and the truck fell and crushed his chest, and he had a near-death experience, and he relived his entire life. And one incident stood out in my mind when he was a teenager, and he was driving his truck down the street, and a drunk man ran out in front of his truck and almost hit him. And Tom, this teenager, was furious because the guy almost dented his truck. So he stopped the truck, rolled down the window, and started yelling at the man. And the man, being quite drunk, reached his hand inside the truck and slapped Tom across the face. Well, that was too much for this young kid. So he opened the door and got out of the truck and started beating this man mercilessly, and left him a bloody mass on the median strip, got back in his truck and drove off. Well, he said that in his life review, when he relived this, he saw through his own eyes his fury, his rage, his adrenaline rush, but also through the eyes of the drunk man. The humiliation, the embarrassment of being beaten up by this young kid, the 32 blows of the fists on his face, feeling his nose getting bloody, feeling his teeth going through his lower lip, and he felt everything this man was feeling. And when he came back from his near-death experience, he came back saying that we are all the same. And what you do to somebody else, you do to yourself. And many near-death experiences say this is one of the lessons of the NDE. It's basically the golden rule, which is a precept of almost every religion we have. You know, you should not hurt other people. What you do unto other people, you do unto yourself. When you hurt someone else, you hurt yourself. When you help someone else, you help yourself. But near-death experiences say for them, it's no longer just a guideline that we're supposed to follow, but they realize it's a law of nature, like gravity. That's just the way things are. And they come back with this sense that what makes life meaningful and fulfilling is living this like this, as if we're all the same, as if we're all interconnected, and you can't hurt someone else without hurting yourself. You can't help someone else without helping yourself.
I just love that. That's so beautiful. What would you say to people that are afraid of death?
That is very common in our society.
Yes, it is.
People are afraid, number one, of dying alone. Number two, of their life ceasing after death. And number three, of maybe being punished after death for not having lived a proper life. And what I would say was that the evidence from near-death experiences is that what happens after death is not something to be afraid of at all. People describe it in a different way, but they almost always agree that it is a beautiful experience. You're accepted, you're loved, there's nothing to be forgiven. You're just accepted for the way you are. You certainly are aware of all your mistakes when you go through your life review. And you may feel the pain that you've inflicted on others, but they aren't sins the way we imagine a sin. It's not something you have to be punished for. When you go through the life review, you experience the consequences of your bad acts, but you're not punished. You're not judged by anybody else, judged just by yourself. So that what happens after death is really something not to be feared, but to be welcomed. Most people who have an NDE say that they are no longer afraid of dying. They're looking forward to dying. Now, that doesn't mean that they want to kill themselves.
Yeah.
You know, when I first heard this as a psychiatrist, I thought, we better not tell people about this. It's going to make them suicidal. So I did a study of this, and I interviewed people who were admitted to my hospital with a suicide attempt. And I compared those who had a near-death experience as a result of the suicide attempt and those who didn't. And what I found was that those who had a near-death experience were much less suicidal than those who didn't have an NDE. which seemed counterintuitive to me because they're no longer afraid of dying.
Mm.
And when I asked them why that was, they said, when you lose your fear of dying, you also lose your fear of living. You're not afraid of losing your life because you know what comes after is better. So you're not afraid of taking chances and jumping with both feet and enjoying it to the most, and getting the most you can out of life. And if that means taking some risks, you do it. And they find life much more meaningful, much more enjoyable, and much more fulfilling than they did before. Now, this sometimes causes problems for doctors, I must say, as a doctor myself, because when someone has a heart attack and doesn't have an NDE, they become much more frightened of dying.
Right.
And when you tell them, you better stop smoking and cut out fatty foods, they do it. When you tell a near-death experiencer, they say, wait a minute, I like smoking. I'm not going to give it up.
Yeah. And you potentially get asked this question. I do a lot based on your research. What is the purpose of us being here? Why are we here? Is there an end goal?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did know the answer to that. Most near-death experiences come back saying that there is a meaning and a purpose to everything that happens here. And it is part of something that is related to the meaning of what goes on in the other realm as well. But when I try to pin them down on, well, why do we come to this physical realm? If something's so great over there, why do we need the physical world? And I don't get a concrete answer to that. It's usually something vague, like there are things you can learn here in the physical realm that you can't learn elsewhere. Maybe you need the adversity we have here that you don't have there in order to learn things, but I don't really fully understand what it is. And I don't think it's something they can put into words that I can understand. But there does seem to be some reason why we are here. It's not just a random event.
Yes, I mean, I don't think anything happens by accident. I've asked all the questions, and you've just offered so much insight. Is there anything you'd like to share with the Passion Harvest audience that I haven't asked you, Dr. Greyson?
Well, one of the most mind-blowing things to me is the accurate out-of-body perceptions that we have. I told you about the story of that first patient I had who saw the stain on my tie.
Amazing.
I don't give that a lot of credence, actually. I mean, it was just mind-blowing for me emotionally. But in terms of a scientist, I didn't have any way of corroborating what was going on. I didn't go and ask every nurse there whether they had seen the stain and told the patient. I just didn't bother to corroborate it. But since then, I've talked to many, many patients where I was able to do a scientific analysis of what they said. And I'll give you an example of that. One fellow was a 55-year-old truck driver who was admitted to the hospital with acute chest pain and had emergency quadruple bypass surgery. 4 of the vessels around his heart had to be replaced. In the middle of the surgery, he said that he left his body and was hovering above the operating table and saw his surgeon flapping his elbows like he was trying to fly. Now, at that point, when he told me this, I've been a doctor for about 30 years. I'd never seen a surgeon do this, never heard about it. You don't see doctors on TV shows doing that.
Right.
So I couldn't imagine how he got this bizarre idea. I assumed he was hallucinating because of the anesthesia or something. So I said to him, this doesn't really sound like it was a real thing to me. He insisted that, well, no, it was definitely real. You can ask my doctor. So with his permission, I did talk to his doctor. And his surgeon said, yes, that is true. I've developed this strange habit that I've never seen any other doctor do. While my assistants are starting the procedure, I get my sterile gown and gloves in, I walk into the operating room, and then I watch them start the procedure. And I don't want to touch anything that's not in the sterile field. So I place my hands, flat palms against my chest, so I know I won't touch anything. And then I point things out to them with my elbows, so I won't touch anything with my fingers.
Oh,
He illustrated
that's
wiggling his
amazing.
elbows around. And somehow the patient knew this. And I don't know how he could have possibly known that, but everyone else corroborated, yes, this surgeon's the only one that does that. And there's no way the patient could have known about that. He had just come into the hospital immediately before the operation on an emergency basis didn't know who was going to operate on him, and somehow knew this. I also have more striking examples from people who saw deceased loved ones and came back with information they shouldn't have had. Now, when I talk about near-death experiences, seeing deceased loved ones, most skeptics will say, well, of course, that's just expectation, wishful thinking. You think you're going to die, so you imagine being met by deceased loved ones. Of course, everybody would do that.
Yeah.
And that may be an explanation for some of these cases. But there are a number of cases where people see deceased individuals who were not known to be dead at the time. And that eliminates the possibility of expectation. We have cases of this going back to ancient Greece and Rome. Pliny the Elder wrote an elaborate case of this in the 1st century. But the one that was most striking to me was a fellow who was a 25-year-old technical writer who was admitted to the hospital with severe pneumonia. He had repeated respiratory arrest where he couldn't breathe. And his primary nurse who worked with him every day was a young woman about his age. And one day she told him she was going to be taking a long weekend off and there'd be other nurses substituting for her. So he said goodbye to her and she took off. And then that weekend, while she was away, he had another respiratory arrest, had to be resuscitated. And during that arrest, he had a near-death experience. And he found himself in this beautiful pastoral scene. And there walking towards him was the nurse, Anita. He did a double take and said, Anita, what are you doing here? And she said, you can't stay here. I want you to go back to your body. And I want you to tell my parents that I'm sorry I wrecked the red MGB.
Oh.
And then she turned and walked away. Well, he later woke up in his body, in his hospital bed. And he told the first nurse who walked into his room about this near-death experience. She got very flustered and left the room immediately. And he later learned that this nurse had taken the weekend off to celebrate her 21st birthday. And her parents surprised her with a red MGB for her birthday. She got excited, jumped in the car, took off for a drive, lost control of the car, smashed into a telephone pole, and died instantly, shortly before his near-death experience. There was no way he could have expected her to have died, and certainly no way he could have known how she died, and yet he did. So, there are a lot of explanations put forward to explain, in terms of physiology, how we can have NDEs. How can physiology explain the way people get this information that they couldn't possibly have known?
Amazing. Gosh, I almost need my tissue box out for that one.
And again, there are many, many, many cases of this. Jan Holden, a professor at University of North Texas, analyzed about 100 cases of out-of-body experiences where people have reported things that could be corroborated. And she found that 92% were corroborated by third persons as being completely accurate. So we're not talking about a rare event here. These are common experiences.
Just remarkable. And I mean, I love, obviously you're a scientist, but you're pursuing the unknown, which is
well, that's
amazing.
How we learn things. That's how we learn things.
Well, some people don't. So I, have to congratulate you for that. And sorry, please go ahead.
I was going to say, the attitudes have changed among physicians in the decades that I've been doing this. When we first started talking about this at medical conferences back in the 1980s, there'd be a polite silence in the audience, and most people thought we were being fooled by a few patients or just making it up ourselves. And now when we talk about these things in medical conferences, doctors will stand up in the audience and say, let me tell you about my experience. So it's very, everyone knows that they happen and that they're very common. There's still a lot of controversy about what causes them, what their ultimate meaning is. But doctors and nurses generally know that these things are happening to their patients and have profound effects on them, and therefore they want to know about them.
I was just going to say, I could see in the background your book, After.
Yes.
It looks beautiful. I love the butterfly on it. Big congratulations for the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Where can people purchase the book?
Anywhere you can find a book.
Okay.
It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any bookstore has them. My website, www.brucegreyson.com, that's Greyson with an E, has links to all these sites and information about near-death experiences and so forth.
And for anyone that's listening or watching, I'll put your links in the show notes as well. If people have had near-death experiences, and can they contact you?
They certainly can, yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, Dr. Greyson, thank you so much for being on Passion Harvest. I'm honored, and it was such an insightful delight, and I can't wait to re-listen to this episode.
Thank you, Louise. It's been fun talking with you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. If you liked this episode, please do subscribe for weekly, passionate, inspirational interviews.